Nothing is quite as polarizing of late as the new MacBook Air with the M2 chip, especially given the whole scenario where Apple has undermined the SSD on the base version, and also it has some heating issues as well when compared specifically to the top tier MacBook Air. Hi guys, welcome back to Honest Straightforward Reviews. Today I'm looking at my MacBook Air that I purchased from Apple. It's the one that's been upgraded. I've got the video playing in the background of its unboxing. If you want to see the proper unboxing of the device, it'll come up on the right hand side right now. And what I've done is I've upgraded not only the CPU, GPU, system on a chip to a 10 core GPU, but also the RAM to 16 gigs, because I think that's quite enough. And you'll see in my tests what I mean about that. And I've also upgraded the hard drive to 1 terabyte. As you guys know, the base 256 is one chip on there, which is half the speed of the older MacBook Air, which is really sad to see, as they're still selling the MacBook Air M1 at the same price with the two chips of 128. Why couldn't they do this on the why couldn't they do the same on this base MacBook Air M2? I do not know, but I have a sneaky guess, Apple's being Apple. The reason I'm doing these tests are because a lot of people buy Macs for Mac software. So I don't buy Mac to use Adobe, because I can use Adobe easily on my PC and it'll cost me a lot less and it'll work a lot better. But on the M1, it's not supported. It gets supported, it'll get supported later on. A new chip comes on, this and that. Whereas the new chip comes on, and if it's Final Cut, it'll get supported immediately. And I looked around a lot. There wasn't anything out there that looked at HEVC, YouTube exports, and HDR and SDR and things like that. So what I'm going to do for this test is just look at Final Cut Pro, export times in HEVC and HDR and SDR. So standard definition and high dynamic range, high dynamic range and standard dynamic range. Now, before I continue, I'd like to let you guys know this channel is completely surviving on your subscriptions and you watching the videos. YouTube isn't showing my videos in your feed even if you're subscribed, so you'll need to check at least once for new videos going and searching for my channel. I upload on a Wednesday Australia time and Saturday, twice a week. Okay, without further ado, let's look at the graph. Now, the very first test that I did was HDR test. Okay, so what I've done is I rendered my project. My project was really heavy on LUTs and things like that. It had some color correction as well, a lot of background music and what you usually basically see in my videos. So it had all of that stuff going for it. So the very first test that I did was on the MacBook Air. Given how short it was, I wanted to show you guys how powerful it was, and I put it up against my MacBook Pro M1 with 16 gigs of RAM. So the only upgrade that I've done on my MacBook Pro M1 is a 16 gig RAM upgrade, and that has been more than sufficient even with Mac OS Monterey installed on it. Now, because it got a fan to it, so I did two tests for the M1 MacBook Pro. So one was auto, so where I didn't muck about with the fans and just let the system take care of the fans, and another test where I maxed the fans out and controlled it myself. Now, first of all, let's look at the M2 MacBook Air. So it finished the rendered test, so it was already rendered. I didn't record the rendering time, but I just recorded the export time in HDR HEVC file, which took 4 minutes and 55 seconds. The MacBook Pro took, with auto fans, took 5 minutes and 16 seconds, and with boosted fans at max it took 5 minutes and 15 seconds. So not much of a difference between the fans. Does the MacBook need fans for a short burst? Let's see. Now, the second test I've got is again a HDR test. I've applied two color corrections here on different things, and I have no render this time. However, what I've done is I have not included an auto fan test on this one. So let's see what it does. So the MacBook Air this time, I really wanted to push it in the HDR department, and it did the export in 30 minutes and 38 seconds, which was pretty good. It's taking advantage of those faster encoders it's got. The M1 MacBook Pro did it with max fans at 49 minutes and 37 seconds. Now you can start to appreciate how long it took it, and how heavy it is. So what I did note though is when you are using the M1 or M2 chip or any of the M chips and you're exporting HDR, I noticed that the M1 or the M2 MacBook Pro in HDR HEVC exports, it did not do the export using all of its cores available. It hardly used it, and it really concentrated on more of the GPU use, but not completely. Even the GPU wasn't maxed out to the full. When we moved off to the MacBook Air with the M2 chip, we saw the similar kind of trend where the CPU cores were hardly used and it was mostly dependent on the GPU. Now, mind you, given the test's outcome, yes, the M2 MacBook Air beat the MacBook Pro M1, even with the fans at full tilt, which is quite impressive. However, you got to remember that not only does it have encoders helping it out, it's also got the 10-core GPU, not the 8-core GPU. You can get the base with the 8-core GPU, which will be beaten by the M1 MacBook Pro in this test. Okay, I've tested it, it beat it. Not by much, but it still beat it because of the slower SSD. So looking at this test, you got to remember the 8-core GPU just gets really bogged down. And looking at the test as well, you can see that it's using around 12 gigs of RAM just for this test. Okay, yes, I'm using max fan control and I'm using the activity monitor and I'm recording screen on top of this. So if I took those out and I've done the test without them, it takes about 10 gigs of RAM, which is still over the 8 gigs of RAM required that the system gives you on the base version. So the 8 gigs of RAM on the base version with the 8 gig GPU, even though it's got the encoder with no fan, really handicaps the system, and it gets beaten by about 10 minutes from the M1 MacBook Pro with the fans running full tilt with the higher gig RAM. Now, it's a completely different story when we go to SDR HEVC exports. So looking at HEVC SDR, so what I did was I did color correction, no rendering, and I've also used a tool because the video I was using had HDR in there. So I was using a tool to remove the HDR aspect of it and use the SDR clip and export it as that. So that took a lot on the system. Now, what I've found for this test is the M1 MacBook Pro did the whole test at 1 hour and 32 minutes and 54 seconds, and the MacBook Air with the M2 with the upgraded SSD, so the faster SSD, nothing handicapping it, with 10 gigs of GPU, faster CPU that Apple claims is faster than the M1, and the 16 gigs of RAM. So it's a lot better computer in every sense, but does not have the fans, and the M1 had full blasted fans. The Air took 2 hours and 27 minutes and 53 seconds, so a lot longer. So for someone like me who is doing a lot of video editing, and I always, for YouTube, I do the exports in HEVC, HDR or SDR, mostly in SDR. So for me, if I'm doing SDR, this doesn't make sense to go for the Air. After seeing what it did in the HDR, I was quite impressed, but I had to spend a lot. It cost me $2,900. Let's look at what's going on in the test. So the test is a lot longer. It gives us a lot more data to play around with. So first of all, if you look at the temperatures for HDR export, the CPU cores were sitting around at 29 degrees. So I've only got the CPU results here, but you can look at the other results as well, the GPU results. So in this test, whereas the last test, the GPU really got stressed, in this test, it doesn't get as stressed. Even in the last test, the GPU cores don't go over the 29 degrees. However, here, they go up to 42 degrees for the GPU, and the CPU cores, I saw them go up all the way to around 80. And when I do a SDR export, they stay around 82, 83, and if I turn off the fan, they spike up to 90 and then kind of thermal throttle a little bit because the auto fans are tuned. Apple have tuned them to not be noisy, so they don't ramp up all the way, even though it's got the potential. So I push them all the way, I leave the room and just let them do their thing. So if you look at the CPU cores on the right side, mid right side, so as you can see, the performance cores are just bumped all the way up. They're really being used, and you've got about, compared to the HDR, you've got about maybe 10% of the CPU available for user. It's just sitting idle for user to use. As you can see, the efficiency cores aren't being completely used. Then you'll see an interesting thing when you're doing an export in SDR is the GPU doesn't get used at all. It's not being pushed to its limit. Whereas with the HDR, the GPU gets used more. Hence the iPad Air beat it so comprehensively. And also the CPU cores were just sitting around, like I think 80% were just sitting there to be used idle. Now let's go on and move on to the MacBook Air. With the MacBook Air, as you can see, it's not the sustained heat does have issue. You'll see if you look at the performance cores, you'll have little spikes going up and down. That's just throttling to get it down. You'll see efficiency cores being used a lot more as well, but still it's not, because it doesn't have the fans, it doesn't give you that same performance. So if you wanted the M2 chip and you wanted a bit of performance, I'd still get the MacBook Pro with the M2 chip, but it's really frustrating seeing that old design and everything like that. What I would have loved to see on the MacBook Pro 13-inch is an upgrade. Use the same chassis as the MacBook Air, give it the same screen and everything, give it MagSafe, and that's it. They didn't have to do much. Leave the Touch ID bar there. I love the Touch ID bar. I use it a lot for my editing and everyday use. I'm one of those people that like it, so I wouldn't have had a problem with the keyboards not being upgraded and all that shenanigans. But it's such a problem. Those two ports aren't enough. But however, when you upgrade the MacBook Air so much, you might as well go to the MacBook Pro. So Apple is pushing you to go for the Pro, especially the 14-inch Pro. What I feel like when they've introduced the M2 Air, they're actually pushing you to not get the M2 MacBook Pro. They're kind of saying, hey, look, it's not got the ports, it's got a fan, yeah, it's old design, don't get it. Get the MacBook Air. But if you get the MacBook Air, it'll thermal throttle a lot more on the base version. The SSD swapping doesn't happen, and because of the swapping being slow, it'll slow the system down. The GPU core upgrade isn't there. So if you wanted, you gotta go higher. If you go higher, you'll get the 10-core GPU. But if you go higher, it almost costs you as much as a MacBook Pro 14-inch. And especially considering now the MacBook Pro has been out for a while, you can get them from Apple refurbished or a second-hand deal on eBay for a lot cheaper. But looking back at our results, so as you can see, the MacBook Air, it doesn't show me the CPU cores and GPU cores yet, but it does get really hot. It does thermal throttle, which everyone has been saying. So as you can see, if you especially go around towards the end of the test, you'll see the performance really tank for a little bit and then come back up and then tank again and things like that throughout the test. So that's basically it, guys. That's what I have found from my testing of the MacBook Air. Unfortunately, as a creative person, if you're doing really light work, it's okay. It's not too bad at all. It's not too shabby, but you'll need to upgrade it. And if you upgrade it, you might as well go the M2 MacBook Pro. The M2 MacBook Pro is going to be a lot better because, one, looking at the HDR test, that MacBook Pro will beat the MacBook Air as the base. And you got to remember, with the MacBook Pro base, let's look at some of the pricing in Australia, in Australian dollars. So the MacBook Air starts at $18.99, which is quite expensive as is, $18.99 over the old MacBook. So the 13-inch MacBook, on the other hand, starts at $19.99. So just $100 more on the M2 gives you the 8-core, 10-core CPU GPU combination, okay, which is going to be a lot better. However, it'll still give you that slower SSD. So to get that upgrade, you need to go to $22.99. okay, so now it's starting to look okay. So if I go to $22.99, what happens then? You can also get the base one and upgrade the RAMs to 16 gig, which will stop the swapping from happening, because on all my tests, the maximum I've seen the M1 MacBook Pro use the RAMs is around, I think 14 was absolutely maximum. Like I had everything open and running everything and exporting Final Cut and running Logic and every single app, and there was a video playing, it used 14 gigs, like just maxing it out. Like nobody will use their computer like that at all, and the 16 gigs were more than enough. So having that into consideration, you might be able to upgrade the base one to 16 gigs for $22.99 and leave the hard drive space to 2256 if you're not too fussed about the speed. But having said that, $299 is not too far off the $22,999. okay, so that's, but if you're looking to save that extra little bit, then I would absolutely be like, yeah, look. But if you upgrade, like let's say the RAMs, so to 16 gigs and the SSD, then you might as well get the MacBook Pro. So see how Apple is trying to push everyone to get the MacBook Pro 14-inch instead of making the MacBook Air an everyday laptop and not short-changing it, and not short-changing the 13-inch MacBook Pro with the M2, not including the MagSafe, slowing down the hard drive, not having as much of a thermal capacity. Now, interestingly, if you get the 8-core, 10-core, 512 SSD MacBook Air, it costs $50 more than the same configuration on the MacBook Pro 13-inch, and you get the fan as well. So if you had to bump it up, you might as well go MacBook Pro 13-inch and save yourself $50. Now that's my analysis of the whole situation. It depends on you. If you're just using everyday use, the M1 MacBook Air will suffice. You can get it secondhand. Don't get it directly from Apple because they haven't dropped down the price, anything like that. The M2 MacBook Air is especially the base has been made so badly that you would get it tanking all the time. Get it if you're really into the aesthetics and the new this and the new that might do it for you, but realistically I'm not too phased by that one. But if you're looking at the M2 MacBook Air for what it is and you really want it and you're not too fussed about all these little export times and things like that, I would get it in that case, but I would still consider the M1 MacBook Air against it. I haven't seen what the CPU cores would do with 18% being better and things like that. I haven't seen the CPU cores being 18% better with a fan. Okay, without a fan maybe. So I would still be going for the second hand or a 10% discount somewhere when you have the MacBook Air M1 on a discount. I would stay away from the M2 MacBook Air. I would consider a second hand M1 MacBook Pro with a 16 gig RAM upgrade any day. That did a really good job. I'm being disappointed really by the direction Apple has been going of late, especially after Steve Jobs' death. And yeah, so that's my personal view of the situation. That's my personal needs, and that's what I wanted to show you guys just with Final Cut. Thank you for watching it to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video and found it informative. Take good care. Bye bye.